There is an old truth that many people learn too early and almost always in silence. The fear of being too much rarely begins where it appears. It does not begin in the adult conversation where your voice suddenly felt too loud. It does not begin in the relationship where you started apologizing for your needs. It does not begin in the room where you went quiet, even though your heart was full. It often begins much earlier, in the look that followed your sadness, in the sigh that answered your excitement, in the subtle cooling of love when you were angry, needy, confused, or simply human in a way that required space. That is the hidden sorrow of people who fear being too much. From the outside, they often do not look overwhelming at all. They may look careful, thoughtful, self aware, polite, easy to be around. They may be the one who says it's okay too quickly, the one who edits the message before sending it, the one who turns hurt into humor before anyone has to hold it, the one who asks whether they are being annoying before they have even fully spoken. People often mistake this for gentleness, and yes, sometimes there is real gentleness there, but there can also be fear. The fear of taking up more emotional room than the world is willing to give. The fear that your sadness will tire someone, that your anger will harden them, that your need will burden them, that your joy will embarrass them, that your longing will expose you, that your full emotional weight, if placed honestly into another person's hands, will make them pull away. That is where the deeper story begins. Because the fear of being too much is rarely about actual excess. More often, it is about adaptation. A person learned somewhere along the way that their inner world created tension in the room, perhaps not always through cruelty, sometimes through subtle reactions, through discomfort, through impatience, through emotional absence, through love that remained available only when they were simple, regulated, and easy to hold. And a child notices this long before a child can explain it. Children are not scholars of psychology, they are readers of atmosphere. They know when the room welcomes them and when it merely tolerates them. They know when a feeling is received and when it is inconvenient. They know when tears soften a caregiver and when tears create irritation. They know when excitement is cherished and when it is too loud, too silly, too disruptive. They know when questions are answered with presence and when they are answered with exhaustion. So the child begins drawing conclusions, not in words, in sensation, in posture, in habit. Be easier, be quieter, be less intense. Do not ask for so much. Do not need at the wrong time. Do not become the emotional center of the room. This is how some people begin shrinking before anyone has actually asked them to. Not because they are false, because they are intelligent. Because the psyche is always trying to preserve connection with the tools it has. And if love feels less secure when you're fully expressed, then self-reduction can begin to feel like wisdom. That is why the fear of being too much is often hidden inside such beautiful behaviors. It hides in thoughtfulness, in empathy, in the instinct to make life easier for others, in the graceful habit of translating your own pain into something more manageable before offering it, in the way you check other people's mood before checking your own pulse, in the way you soften your truth so it will land more gently, more acceptably, more safely. What looks like emotional maturity can sometimes be emotional caution with elegant language. That does not make it fake, it makes it sad. Because the person who fears being too much is often carrying an unspoken question through ordinary life. How little of myself must I show to remain lovable? And what a devastating question that is. Because it does not only shape relationships, it shapes identity. It shapes what a person permits themselves to feel, ask, reveal, and become. It teaches them to trim their edges before anyone can reject them for having edges at all. It teaches them to arrive in edited form, to bring the version of the self that is easiest to keep around, to perform emotional neatness even when something inside is messy, uncertain, or aching for contact. Soon, this no longer feels like performance, it feels like personality. I'm just low maintenance. I'm just sensitive. I'm just bad at asking for things. I'm just someone who overthinks. I'm just more comfortable handling things alone. But many identities are stitched together from old adjustments, and old adjustments repeated often enough start sounding like truth. This is why some people become deeply uncomfortable with their own needs. Not because the needs are unnatural, because need itself became associated with risk. The risk of being dismissed, of being misunderstood, of being seen as dramatic, of hearing in someone's tone, expression, or withdrawal that your emotional world has become too heavy for the bond to carry. So even when they long for reassurance, they may hesitate before asking. Even when they are hurt, they may minimize it. Even when they crave closeness, they may present themselves as fine. Even when they want to reach, they may first apologize for the reaching. There is such loneliness in that. To need deeply and offer that need only in fragments. To want to be met and then water down the very language that would make meeting possible. To ache for closeness while hiding the parts that would make intimacy real. And over time, this creates a particular inner split. One part of the person feels intensely. Another part supervises the feeling. Is that too much? Should that be smaller? Should that be delayed? Should that be hidden? Will this change the atmosphere? Will this make them tired? Will this make them leave? It becomes an internal negotiation that happens so quickly it can look like instinct. The person may not even realize how much of their emotional life is being filtered through imagined reactions, but the body knows. The body knows the tension of containment. The body knows the ache of holding back tears until they become pressure. The body knows the fatigue of always translating raw feeling into something socially survivable. This is why people who fear being too much are often exhausted in ways that do not match the visible events of their day. The tiredness is not only from what happened, it is from what was managed. From the grief turned into composure, from the anger turned into self-questioning, from the need turned into restraint, from the affection turned into carefulness, from the private labor of making sure no part of the self spills too far outside the borders of acceptability. That labor is invisible to most people, sometimes even to the person performing it. Because this pattern is often rewarded, the careful one is praised for being mature. The self-minimizing one is praised for being easygoing. The endlessly understanding one is praised for being kind. The one who almost never demands, never erupts, never takes up too much room, is praised for being emotionally intelligent. But the world does not always know how to tell the difference between peace and suppression. It sees the surface result. It does not always see the cost. And the cost can be enormous because once a person becomes afraid of their own weight, they begin living as if love must be protected from them. They become overly responsible for how others experience them. They monitor tone. They soften truth. They over-explain. They apologize for timing, for emotion, for honesty, for ordinary human need. They become curators of their own existence. That is not freedom. That is a life lived with one hand constantly over the volume dial. Then relationships make the pattern even sharper, because love awakens longing, and longing awakens exposure. Suddenly there's more to lose, more possibility, more hope, more fear that the deeper self, once revealed, may not be handled with care. So the person may start doing something very subtle. They may test. Reveal a little, then pull back. Need a little, then apologize. Express hurt, then immediately soften it. Want reassurance, then say it is not necessary. Move toward closeness, then feel shame for wanting it that much. This is what the fear of being too much often looks like in adult intimacy. Not dramatic intensity, but interrupted honesty. A person says, that hurt me, then immediately adds, but maybe I'm overreacting. A person says, I miss you, then laughs as if it was casual. A person says, I need more from this, then rushes to explain why they know the other person is busy, stressed, tired, doing their best. The feeling is never allowed to stand on its own legs. It must come dressed in disclaimers. Why? Because direct emotional weight feels dangerous to a nervous system that learned long ago that weight changes the room. Some people know this pattern through romantic love. Others know it in friendship, family, work, even spirituality. Anywhere there is a relationship between self-expression and belonging, the fear can emerge. The body asks the same question in many different rooms. Will I still be wanted if I stop editing myself? That question can haunt a person quietly for years. Sometimes it appears as perfectionism. If you can say things exactly right, maybe you will not be too much. Sometimes it appears as people-pleasing. If you stay useful enough, maybe your own emotional gravity will be forgiven. Sometimes it appears as self-isolation. If you reveal less, no one can reject what they never fully receive. Sometimes it appears as hyper-independence. If you do not need much, you will never have to feel the humiliation of being seen as emotionally expensive. Different strategies, same wound. The wound is not that you feel deeply. The wound is that depth once felt dangerous to reveal. That distinction matters, because people who fear being too much often carry shame around the wrong thing. They feel ashamed of the intensity, the longing, the need, the emotional fullness itself. But fullness is not the problem. Fullness is human. The pain comes from what fullness encountered, from the rooms that could not hold it, from the faces that tightened, from the love that became conditional around expression, from the repeated emotional lesson that the self must be diluted to stay connected. This is how some people become half visible without realizing it. They are present, but in reduced form. Loved, perhaps, but often for how manageable they have become. Heard, but only through layers of editing. Accepted, but only after the most unruly parts have been trimmed away. What a painful kind of belonging that is. To be welcomed in proportion to how little inconvenience your humanity causes. And yet the deepest tragedy is that the person may begin to participate in this reduction themselves. They may become the first one to silence their own need, the first one to excuse another's emotional absence, the first one to tell themselves they are probably asking for too much, feeling too much, reacting too much, hoping too much. This is where the fear becomes internal. No one else has to reject you immediately because a part of you has already started doing it in advance. You become the gatekeeper of your own tenderness, the editor of your own longing, the one who says hush before the world even has the chance. That creates a specific kind of grief. Not only the grief of not being met, but the grief of slowly learning to abandon yourself with exquisite politeness. And because this often happens in small moments, it can be hard to name. There is rarely one dramatic scene that explains everything. More often, it is the accumulation, the little ways you swallowed, the little ways you apologized, the little ways you became easier, the little ways you trained your own body to believe that authenticity must be cushioned before it can be offered, like water wearing down stone, like smoke settling into curtains, like sediment thickening at the bottom of a river until the current can no longer move clearly. That is how the fear of being too much deepens, not always through catastrophe, but through repetition. And repetition becomes belief. Soon, even tenderness can feel dangerous. A person who fears being too much may long desperately to be chosen, yet grow suspicious when someone actually wants closeness, because real closeness threatens to reveal the hidden parts, the ache, the dependency, the disappointment, the anger, the tenderness, the need to matter. And what if those things are not handled well? What if being fully seen leads not to intimacy, but to retreat? What if being known turns out to be another way of being measured and found excessive? So even love can feel double-edged, desired, but destabilizing. That is why some people appear calm while privately carrying enormous emotional intensity. They are not empty. They are over-contained. Their inner world is not shallow. It is supervised. And supervision, over time, becomes its own form of loneliness. Because there is a loneliness in feeling that your real emotional scale can never be shown at full size. A loneliness in being loved while half hidden. A loneliness in realizing that many of your relationships know your edited self far better than your unedited one. And still, even inside this pattern, there's often something profoundly beautiful. People who fear being too much are often deeply conscientious. They care about impact. They do not move carelessly through other people's feelings. They notice, they reflect, they want to love well. These are not small qualities. The problem is not that they care. The problem is that care has become fused with self-erasure. Empathy becomes self-silencing. Thoughtfulness becomes over-monitoring. Gentleness becomes fear of honesty. Sensitivity becomes suspicion of one's own emotional legitimacy. That fusion is what hurts. Because then every real need carries two burdens, the need itself and the shame of having it. A person may feel hurt by something completely valid, and yet the first wave that rises is not simply pain, it is embarrassment. They may want reassurance, and the first feeling is guilt. They may want more closeness, and the first response is self-criticism. They may be angry, and before the anger fully forms, it is already being diluted into apology. This is how some people lose access to their own emotional truth. Not because the truth is absent, because shame keeps interrupting its signal. And once shame enters the room, the person begins measuring themselves against impossible standards of acceptability. Be more graceful. Be less reactive. Need less. Wait longer. Ask more carefully. Take up less air. Be grateful for what is given. Do not reveal the full size of the ache. What a relentless way to live. To always be managing the possibility that your humanity might exceed someone's comfort. No wonder the body becomes tired. No wonder joy can feel fragile. No wonder relationships can become confusing. A person living this way is not only trying to connect, they are trying to connect without disturbing, without burdening, without becoming heavy. They are trying to be loved in a way that leaves everyone else comfortable. But love worthy of the name cannot require that kind of disappearance. A real bond does not ask you to arrive weightless. It does not ask you to apologize for sadness, hunger, complexity, or contradiction. It does not make you earn care by becoming easier than you really are. It may ask for honesty, accountability, patience, mutuality, but not erasure. Still, someone shaped by the fear of being too much may not fully trust that, because trust is not built from ideas. It is built from repeated emotional experience. And if repeated emotional experience taught you that your fullness threatens connection, then the idea that you could be fully human and still fully loved may feel almost unbelievable. Not because you lack insight, because the body has its own memory. It remembers the old bargain. Be smaller and love will stay softer. But that bargain comes at a devastating cost, because a life spent becoming smaller eventually creates its own suffering. The person may remain lovable, desirable, useful, easy to keep around, but inside there can be a persistent ache, a sense of incompleteness, a grief that no amount of surface affection seems to touch. Why? Because the soul does not only want love, it wants to be loved in proportion to its reality. Not the polished version, not the careful version, not the reduced version. The real one. The one who can be tender and angry, needy and generous, confused and wise, exhausted and still worthy, complicated and still welcome. This is what the fear of being too much often hides. Not a lack of strength, but a starving hope. The hope that somewhere, somehow, there might be a room where nothing essential about you has to be reduced before it can be received. Maybe that is why small acts of attunement can feel so overwhelming to people with this pattern. Someone notices you are holding back. Someone stays calm when you are emotional. Someone does not flinch when your need becomes visible. Someone lets your feeling stand without rushing to minimize it, fix it, or make it smaller. To others, these may seem like ordinary moments, but to someone whose history taught them otherwise, such moments can feel almost miraculous. Not because they are asking for too much, because they have lived too long with too little room. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation at the center of all this. The fear of being too much is often not about actual excess. It is about the memory of insufficient holding, about the places where your natural emotional size met limited capacity, about the rooms that could not contain what was entirely human in you, about the love that had conditions you were too young to name but old enough to feel. Once that is understood, something tender becomes possible. Not instant freedom, not sudden ease, but understanding. And understanding matters. Because shame says you are too intense. Understanding says you learn to fear your own scale in rooms that could not hold it. Shame says your needs are the problem. Understanding says your needs were not always met with safety, so now even having them feels risky. Shame says you ruin things by feeling too much. Understanding says you were shaped by environments where feeling honestly changed the atmosphere in painful ways. That shift is quiet, but it changes the whole emotional landscape. It turns the pattern from flaw into history, from personal defect into adaptation, from self-contempt into grief. And grief, unlike shame, can actually tell the truth. The truth is not that you are too much. The truth may be that you have spent years carrying normal human feelings inside a nervous system, trained to treat those feelings as dangerous. The truth may be that your tenderness became frightened of its own volume. The truth may be that your heart is not excessive, only tired of translating itself into smaller language. And there is nothing shameful about that. There is sadness in it. There is history in it. There is longing in it, but no shame. So if this reflection found something living in you, let it stay there a little while. Let it sit beside the part of you that learned to apologize for need, the part that still asks whether it is being too much, the part that braces when honesty rises in the throat because some older room taught it that truth changes the climate. There is nothing wrong with how carefully you learned to survive. And if you want more reflections like this, more language for the hidden emotional patterns that shape why a person withholds, softens, aches, and longs to be received without shrinking first, stay close. Sometimes the first relief is not being told to feel less. It is finally hearing that your fear was never proof that you were too much, only proof that somewhere along the way, the room was not enough.